So the idea is to provide a single place where all the public information and information I've written about Brexit is available, so businesses can understand the aspects that are relevant to them. So I'll start with the bit we know, and then I'll get on to what's not so well known. And what we know is that in the 2020 timeframe, that what's possible in terms of an agreement between the United Kingdom and Ireland is very, very little, unfortunately. So the very best that's going to happen by the end of the year is a very, very basic agreement dealing with trade in goods. And then the worst that's going to happen, which is not a lot different really, qualitatively speaking, is a no-deal Brexit. So in either event, what we're looking at in 2021 is the reality of every time you want to move a fork or a spoon or anything whatsoever across the Irish Sea, you're talking about undertaking new processes which are quite challenging, and I think will mean a lot of business models won't function anymore because it just simply won't be profitable in certain types of sectors to continue to buy if you're in the UK from Ireland and if you're in Ireland from the UK. So where we're at is the EU is willing to offer a trade agreement with no tariffs on goods and no quotas, which means no limits on what can be exported. But in return for that, the EU is insisting on level playing field rules. And at the moment, that's proving controversial. The UK has announced that it's not going to be bound by any rules and it's going to be free to do what it wants. But ultimately, if there is to be any type of trading agreement, there will have to be level playing field rules of some sort, at least in relation to things like competition, employment, tax, regulatory standards, because otherwise you'd have the scenario of the so-called Singapore on Thames, which the UK has threatened as an actively, like a more aggressive option if it didn't get a deal. I might go back out here then. So the big thing about Brexit, no matter what, in both case scenarios, is that in 2021, every movement of goods across the Irish Sea, and this really sounds surprising and maybe hard to believe, but every movement of goods is going to require 2 tax returns in advance every single time. And quite significant tax returns with quite a good bit of consequence about them. So every time goods move, you've got to make a prior declaration to either the revenue or HMRC, and usually both, because if you think about it, you're either an Irish business importing. Sorry, I think the sound isn't, I'll go back up here, the sound seems a bit better up on the stage. Right. So basically, to move goods at all in 2021, what you're going to need is to make a prior return both to the Irish revenue and the UK revenue in advance and have it cleared. And basically, before you can move, you've got to get clearance on the UK side and on the Irish side. And in fact, the final clearance will only take place just before the goods arrive. So it'll usually half an hour before the ferry comes. The revenue or HMRC will give you the green routing. They may equally give you a routing requiring a query and documents to be furnished, or they may even require examining the particular consignment itself to see that what is there conforms with what you say. If that wasn't complicated enough, there's whole logistical issues about doing customs declarations on both sides, because you need somebody who's established, and what established means is that they have a business presence, they're residents, they're incorporated, they have a presence on both sides. So it's not very easy. I've come across lots of cases where Irish exporters have said, I know my English clients won't do the imports themselves. They're just not going to do it, they're going to go to someone else. But it's not terribly easy to do customs on both sides because you need an establishment. So you need an entity or a company or a place over there to make customs declarations at all. That's very, very dramatic and very significant and profound. Even if there's no customs-free, tariff-free agreement, there'll still be, if there's no customs-free, if there's no free trade agreement, there's a lot of areas which have zero tariffs at present. But with a customs agreement or free trade agreement, you would expect zero tariffs in most areas. But what might be a nasty surprise is that value-added tax is always paid when goods enter the country concerned. So if you're exporting to the UK, the value-added tax has to be paid at the point of entry. And equally, on goods coming into Ireland, the value-added tax has to be paid at the point of entry. If you're a business, you can get guarantees and you can defer it for a period, but ultimately, and you might, if you're a business selling on, you might be able to offset that VAT against your sales, but ultimately it has to be accounted for. Now, if you think about that, that creates a very significant problem for people who sell to consumers, like typically small businesses who are maybe selling small items, because your average consumer in the UK doesn't have a tax number, isn't able to pay VAT at the border. So really what you're talking about in those situations, and the main ones would be postal sales or parcel couriers for small package consignments, a situation where the best case scenario was that the UK buyer has to pay the customs duty before the goods are released. If you've ever taken in goods from the United States or outside the EU, you'll be familiar with it. But that's a very, very significant obstacle. There's some small mitigations that may be available. I mean, it's possible for very small value goods below £135 and €150 to register in Ireland for UK VAT, so that you can remove that from your customers, so that at least the parcel courier or the post can deliver, assuming there's no customs duties. But my concern is that in a lot of smaller scale businesses, it'll be easier to buy locally in the UK than it'll be to do all that paperwork. It's bad enough that you have to take on customs in both directions coming in from the UK and Ireland for the first time in 40 years. But in fact, the particular challenges of doing customs across the Irish Sea is much more difficult than present type of customs, because typically what happens at customs at the moment is they come in from far away in a large container ship, and they're cleared in Dublin. So in Dublin, in Ireland, there's expertise in clearing customs inwards and outwards. But there's not many people who can clear customs on both sides in advance. I mean, to coordinate the doing of returns, both on the export side and import side, is very difficult. I should explain, this might be very surprising. When you export goods, you have to complete a customs declaration that's almost as detailed as when you import them. Importing, it's more challenging and it's more likely to be checked, but there's a declaration of about 35 different pieces of data have to be assembled, and that's quite challenging, and the coordination is really, really difficult, and the logistics is difficult because most people are looking at having their logistics provider do it, but the problem is you have two sides, and you might be buying, you might want your logistics provider to do it, but the UK logistics provider mightn't be very happy about doing it. Another issue is that a declaration is required for every consignment. And what a consignment is, it's a unique sale from a given buyer to a given seller. So if you're a large-scale company that's moving 6 containers from one branch of your company to the other, that's fine, it's one declaration. But if you're a very small business selling low-value items with a low profit margin, it's still a declaration per item. So you could have, as I say, 6 containers with one declaration, but you could have a pallet with dozens of declarations on it. And that means that low-value business will find it extremely challenging, quite apart from doing the declarations on both sides. Even if you do it in-house, you're still going to incur costs, which I'll mention. But in any event, when it's per consignment, it's more than enough to take the profit margin out in a lot of cases. The actual requirements for customs declarations are quite nitpicky. I mean, you can get used to it in your particular business. It's manageable. Sometimes it's manageable. Sometimes it's more challenging. But basically, every single thing has to be classified in accordance with what's called a tariff schedule, the tariff, where there's about 17,000 different types of goods. Now, if you're selling the same goods over and over again, you'll know, but sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll have to dig quite deeply to see what the correct classification is. You have to value every goods in accordance with very artificial rules, and that has to be not just the price, it's the value, but you have to add on the cost of transporting it to the country. So if the other side's paying for the insurance and the carriage and the transport across the Irish Sea, you've got to work out the value, you've got to add those on to the value. And then customs duties payable on top of that. And then VAT's payable on top of that, even on top of the customs duty. Critically, there's the tax return, but obviously the actual physical goods have to conform with what's in the return. So revenue of necessity and HMRC, who's the UK revenue, will have to check a certain amount of consignments to see that actually what's returned is what's there. And as a trader, you don't want to damage or imperil your reputation by not making inaccurate returns. I mean, quite apart from civil tax consequences, If you do it deliberately, there's criminal consequences. There's just reputational issues with the revenue and HMRC. And if you do it once, you'll find a far greater proportion of all your consignments, your movements will be intervened and checked by revenue. So that'll make your life even more difficult. Customs and VAT are obviously taxes, so you're subject to all the possibilities of audit, and you have to keep all the documents for every single transaction. You've got to, like for example, on the returns, you've got to reference your invoice and your transport document and any other certificates or licenses, and you've got to have them so when revenue come back in all the years down the line, they can cross-check your returns with what actually went in and out, with the real-life world correlating your invoices with your actual sales. That's quite apart from interventions at the border, finding that something's not being done right. So on top of that, if there's a no-deal exit, you have customs duties in a lot of sections, in a lot of sectors over and above the VAT. There's probably going to be zero tariffs against most type of goods, but they have to originate in the other country, or usually one of the two countries. So if you're bringing in Chinese goods, for example, you could actually have a double customs duty hit when they come into Ireland and again when they're exported into Great Britain. So that's very, very significant. So if you want to claim the zero duty under the trade agreement, you have to prove origin, and that can be onerous. It depends on the type of goods. You need certifications. The best case scenario is you can quote certain manufacturers who are authorised to give coded declarations as to origin, and basically standing over that the goods originate in UK or the EU, as the case may be. No matter what, if you do customs in-house, you're going to have training. You can't do it directly with Ross. You have to buy software. It's doable. You can train people. But in practice, it's quite difficult for a lot of businesses because you've got to be there when the ship comes in, quite literally, if you're importing. Because if revenue ask for documents or revenue ask to actually see the goods and the consignment, if they ask for documents, someone has to be there effectively to email it to Ross. But if it's the 1 or 2% of cases, and obviously inevitably in the long run everyone's going to be checked, there might be a light touch at first, your carrier has to be there to facilitate the examination, and obviously the trader is the person who pays for that. You know, if the revenue check, you know, they're entitled to do. It's basic policing. So the carrier is the person who's the innocent person carrying the costs in it. So there's the cost of doing declarations, but there's the cost of the inevitable checks and delays, and either doing it in-house, which is challenging, but hiring customs agents or your freight forwarders, which I think most businesses would do, to actually attend to revenue, or on the UK side, HMRC, who's UK revenue, to deal with it. So you're going to have, you can have random checks, and the EU lay down that a certain percentage of checks have to be checked. An important point is customs aren't an Irish tax, they're European Union, and the Irish revenue have to enforce the EU rules. In the past, they've been subject to fines and sanctions for not doing it and not doing it intensely enough. There'll probably be some easements and light touch in the early days, but ultimately the law's got to be enforced. On the UK side, because they won't be in the EU, they have a little bit more freedom for discretion and maybe a little bit more light touch. And just before the last Brexit dates in 2019, they did advertise that they would, if a hard Brexit happened, they wouldn't be as strict for a while, and certain simplifications were there. They've withdrawn those now. I suspect if it comes next December that they'll probably put them back. I mean, further complications, apart from taking on the costs of doing this, the in-house organisation, paying a freight forwarder or a customs agent on both sides, is that if Brexit, when the worst case Brexit finally happens, okay, a lot of it will be priced into sterling, but there's a probability of a further fall in sterling, which is an extra challenge for Irish businesses. Because we know the moment Brexit happened, there was this 8, 9, 10% fall in sterling overnight. So that's the kind of environment that Irish exporters to the UK are going to face. You also have the fact that, as I mentioned, this type of customs scenario is quite unprecedented, because usually customs come in from a long distance and the customs agents only have to handle one side. Here, what you have is a unique customs environment, and you have lots of people on a steep learning curve who haven't done customs processing for 30, 40 years. I mean, yes, you have to have customs at the moment if you're importing from outside the EU, but for the estimate is that the returns will go up 15 times. So the revenue systems, computer-wise, are able to handle it, but they've taken on a lot of staff, but there's going to be a lot of people on a steep learning curve, and if people are getting their returns wrong, basically the more likely scenario is that the goods won't move at all. But we can expect delays and tailbacks is totally inevitable, in UK ports, Ireland to the UK. I won't go into the land bridge because that's a significant issue in itself. Like goods moving from Ireland to EU 26 from the continent has to go through a process very similar to customs. They have to be put under a secured transit, which involves making a detailed declaration with more or less the same 35 items on it, 35 items on it, and made a return, and there's checks when it enters the UK, leaves the EU, and then leaves the UK and goes back into the EU and France. Cursory checks, but that's happening in an environment where there's a very high risk of GB to French trade being snarled up at Dover. So there's most definitely going to be complications here, to say the least. There are other issues. I don't want to make this overly pessimistic, but on top of it, all the rules of trade are changing overnight. So customs is probably the most acute aspect, because you suddenly have a situation where you can't move a fork across the Irish Sea. But on top of it, you have things like immigration rules change happily not for Irish citizens, but for EU 26 citizens. But there's a lot of EU 26 citizens working in Ireland and vice versa in the UK. They have a better position in the UK because they have settled status, but people who aren't settled in the UK, there's immigration issues with people driving to there, there's licensing issues. The actual carriers at the moment are maybe authorised to do business in the EU and UK. When UK carriers, and this will cut both ways, when the carriers won't have the legal authorisation to operate in the other jurisdiction, that'll complicate the whole economics of what they're doing, because they may not be able to do a return journey. And then on top of that, just generally, lots of areas of law are changing overnight. I mean, literally most commercial rules that have been written since 1972, like Big Bang, are just going to basically change overnight. It's not just customs that the revenue are checking on and HMRC are checking on. I mean, I mentioned, everyone talks about there'll probably be an agreement with very low tariffs. It's not really about the customs duties. It's the process of having to make the returns. And one of the main reasons the returns are made is because customs act as agent for all the other government departments, and they're checking for compliance issues with goods. And the classic one is agriculture. And I mentioned in agriculture, basically nearly everything is checked. But that also applies to any other type of products. About 60% of all products are subject to CE regulation, where you can't lawfully market them in the EU unless they have been marked in accordance with an EU-wide system of CE marking and authorised persons. So you're having a situation where UK manufacturers are going to have their goods certified in the EU, and if they don't, there's issues over that, and that's effectively checked at the border. A very important point, which kind of most people miss, is that this cuts both ways. Everyone's talking about the UK businesses being closed out of the EU, but you've got to remember Irish businesses are equally closed out of Great Britain because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that's very profound and it's not really understood. And, had this happened 30 or 40 years ago, I think Ireland would have had to leave with Britain. But it's very challenging to lose access to the UK markets in that way. The common travel area will probably help a little bit because it gives rights for Irish citizens to move freely between the UK and Ireland. It gives rights to go and work as a self-employed person, but it's not the same. It's not enforceable in the same way as the EU rules. It's loose. It can be withdrawn very easily. So I want to just end with something slightly positive. And for the most part, the challenges in exporting goods are quite considerable. But there are some opportunities. Unfortunately, I think they're mainly in the area of services. And I think really what Brexit does is a lot of UK-based firms are going to have to get a foothold in the European Union in order to keep trading in the European Union sensibly. So Ireland does have a good offering there because of English language, family connections, a similar legal system. Equally on foreign direct investment coming in from the Anglophone world, from the United States, Australia and so on. I think Ireland will take a lot of what would have gone to the UK. So what you're looking at is a profound adjustment period, I think, where lots of businesses will find a crisis next year. And it's now set that the bomb is ticking now. It's very hard to undo this. The UK would have to ask for an extension of the exit date by July 2020, and they've actually put in their law that it's illegal to do so. So they could at the last minute in July ask for it. The EU is saying if the extension hasn't been asked for by July, it's already too late. So what you're looking at is the best case scenario is what people would have called a hard Brexit 2 or 3 years ago, because it's what's called a free trade agreement, which implies customs, regulations, returns and everything. People were hoping for something much closer, like a customs union or single market. But the best case scenario is pretty challenging, and the worst case scenario was no deal, which is very, very challenging. And the type of deal that's likely to be got before next December won't deal with a lot of all the other peripheral issues. It'll deal with goods, but it won't deal with services, data, IP, contracts. So the very best you can have in that situation is, even if there's a trade agreement, you'll have a lot of little sticky plaster type situations. So look, thank you very much. I'm quite happy to take any questions. I have a website which I've tried to catalogue all these issues on. I've tried to put up the public information to try and make sense, and I really feel the business community doesn't appreciate how serious this is. It's really going to, and it's just collateral damage in the whole Brexit process that the UK is beginning to realise, and it just regards this as the price that's worth paying. Okay, thank you very much.